Historical Society in Elmira, New York with Vin Van Etten. For the record, could you give us your full name and your date of birth?
Elwyn R. Van Etten.
Okay.
My birth date is April 13th, 1925.
Okay, thank you. This recording is for the Veterans History Project, and again, for the record, could you state the wars that you served in?
I was in World War II, and I was also in during Korea,
Okay.
and ended up in the reserves
Okay.
after those two
Okay.
stints.
Could you tell me how you ended up, how did you get into the military to begin with?
I went to Syracuse University the fall of 1942. In November, they were recruiting for the Navy V1 program, which was basically at that time for college students. And in November of 42, I signed up in the V1 program. From there, I spent the 2 semesters at Syracuse. In the meantime, Uncle Sam changed the program to V12, and I got called to active duty in the V12 program on the 1st of July, 1943.
What was the program like at Syracuse? What did you do?
I was just a normal, regular student, nothing to do with Navy, Army, or anything else, other than the Army kicked us out of our dormitory for the 2nd semester up there. The Army had a specialized program too at colleges at that time, and so they moved us all out of the dormitory and turned the dormitory over to the Army.
Where did the Navy guys go then?
Well, we were not in the Navy until we reported in 1st of July in 43.
Okay.
And I got sent to Dartmouth
Okay.
College up in New Hampshire. And I spent 3 semesters up there as an apprentice seaman. We actually were in the Navy when we reported to Dartmouth. Prior to that, we were just civilian students. And so I spent 3 semesters up at Dartmouth.
What courses did you take in Syracuse? Do you remember any of them?
Well, I started out in engineering. And at the end of the 1st semester, it was apparent that I didn't belong in engineering school. Because when I reported for my 2nd semester, on my file was see the Dean of Men. And the Dean of Men said, you know, your 1st semester was sort of disastrous. And he said, we wonder if you're in the right school. And dearly beloved Syracuse and so on and so forth sent me through 3 days of vocational testing and so on and so forth, and said, we'll keep you for the 2nd semester on probation, but we feel certain you ought to transfer to business school. So I joined Biz Ed the 2nd semester, and I did better. I didn't make Dean's List or set the world on fire, but I did better than the 1st semester. So, and at Dartmouth, I only had to take 2 required courses at Dartmouth. The rest of the time I spent at Tuck School, which is their biz ad school, at Dartmouth, taking accounting, statistics, economics, geography, and all courses that really tied in with my business ad degree coming forth at Syracuse. So I spent 3 semesters there at Dartmouth. And from there, do you want me to go on? From there, between Dartmouth and Midshipman School, they sent 12 of us from Dartmouth to Supply Corps Midshipman School that was going to be at Harvard. But there was a gap in there, and they sent us to Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And of course, that was a big sub base during World War II. They really didn't know what to do with us at Portsmouth. We were gophers for all practical purposes, you know, go get coffee for the 2 guys in the back room and take this paper over to the commanding officer's office and so on and so forth. So we spent About 7 weeks, I think it was, at Portsmouth. And it was a great time to be able to go to Hampton Beach, which was just down the road. And we spent a lot of time there, and that's where I met my wife, was at Hampton Beach.
Can you say more about that?
Well, she was the last girl I ever picked up on the beach. I met her at the band concert. They have a bandstand at Hampton Beach, and my buddy and I picked up 2 girls. And as we're going out through the crowd and so on and so forth, I said to Bob, "Which girl do you want?" And he said, "I think I like the dark-haired one." I said, "Okay, I'll take the other one." And now, 58 years later, we're still living together.
That's great. What was it like at Hampton Beach at that time?
Well, it was a sailor's paradise because all of the able-bodied men were gone in the service and so on and so forth. So we were outnumbered. I don't know the number, but we must have been outnumbered 10 to 1. It was, as I say, a sailor's paradise. So,
who were the women who would come there? What was your wife doing there? Was she there?
She was on vacation.
Okay.
She worked in Boston, and she and her girlfriend were on vacation for a week up at Hampton. Hampton had a reputation for being rather a wild place in the late 30s and so on and so forth. And she had never been allowed to go to Hampton, and her parents finally acquiesced to her going on a vacation to Hampton with her girlfriend in 1944, and so that's how it all happened. So.
Okay. And where were you from? Just to back up a little bit, where were you from originally?
Corning.
You're from Corning. Okay.
Corning, New York. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm one of the few local natives of this territory. There's lots of strangers, in here. Of course, I live in Big Flats now.
Right, right.
And so.
Okay. What happened after Dartmouth? How did you get more involved?
Well, we went to Portsmouth, and then we went on from Portsmouth to Harvard at Cambridge, Mass.
Okay.
For midshipman school, which was Supply Corps midshipman school. And I reported in there, sometime the tail end of August of 44. And then I got my commission the 10th of January in 45. Got my commission at 11 o'clock in the morning and married Ginny at 4 o'clock that afternoon.
Oh, wow.
You couldn't get married as a midshipman until you were commissioned. They didn't allow midshipmen to have wives. So we were married, and we went from there.
Wow.
From Harvard, I was assigned to the USS Elkart, named after Elkart, Indiana. It was an APA, which was an attack transport. It was not in commission when I was ordered to her. It actually went in commission the 8th of February in 1945 out in San Pedro or Long Beach, California. And so I went to the Small Craft Training Center out in San Pedro, Roosevelt Base it was called. And then the ship went in commission the 8th of February. And you want me to keep talking? So we had our shakedown cruises out on the West Coast. We practiced landings down at Oceanside, which was the Marine Corps base and so on and so forth at Oceanside. We spent until the 1st of April, so we spent about a month and 3/4 on shakedown cruises. We left the States on the 1st of April in 45. This was an attack transport, and we took a load of Marines from the West Coast. We were headed for Manchuria, which was one of the, I don't know whether it's Marianas or one of the other groups of islands. But we took these troops to Majuro, and were scheduled to come back to Pearl Harbor and take more troops from there further west into the Pacific. Well, the orders got changed, and we came back into the States on VE Day, on the 8th of May in 1945. And we had minor repairs to the vessel and so on and so forth. And then we went to San Francisco, and we shipped out from San Francisco with Army troops. And we were then out there for a pretty good length of time. So I never was in any great battles. We hit 37 different ports of call out in the Pacific. The only action we really saw was when we were swinging on the hook in Okinawa, and that was with the war winding down, really. The kamikaze attacks were quite common. The Japanese were getting quite a few vessels with their kamikaze attacks. And we were in Okinawa Harbor for, I would guess 10 days. And those kamikaze planes came over almost every night. They waited till midnight, until after we had hit the sack and so on and so forth, and sooner to get to sleep and general quarters would sound. Our ship made smoke. We were not allowed to fire. You've heard plenty about friendly fire. Well, that was a concern at that time. With so many vessels in the harbor, it would have been real easy for some of our bullets and so on and so forth to get in trouble with one of our compatriot. So we made smoke. We had smoke generators that the LCVPs that we carried aboard ship, they're landing craft vehicle for personnel. They're small. They would carry maybe 20, 24 men and so on. But we would put our LCVPs in the water with smoke generators on them and make smoke. We weren't the only ones making smoke in the harbor. But the kamikazes were successful during that span of time. They got about 5 or 6 destroyers that were on what was called the picket line. There was a line of destroyers west of Okinawa trying to intercept the kamikazes when they came in, before they had a chance to hit anybody in the harbor at Okinawa. And we lost 5 or 6 destroyers. And there was a merchant vessel about 1,000 yards from us that got hit with a kamikaze while we were in Okinawa. So that was, and I guess I was so young, I was too young to be afraid. I was standing, the searchlights have got these kamikaze planes in their beam and so on and so forth. You see them up there, and we're standing on deck watching them, which was a little bit dangerous if you think about it. If they decided to come after us, although we were covered with smoke from our own smoke screen and so on and so forth. But so from there, it wasn't too long after that we dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And we had great difficulty comprehending the magnitude of the bomb. I would guess everybody did. It was something that was, never even thought of, or obviously had never been used before or anything like that. The magnitude, when we got word aboard ship about the bombs being dropped and how many thousands of people did it kill and what it did to the cities and so on and so forth, it was almost beyond our comprehension. Yeah. And then We were in Ulithi when the war ended. That was an atoll out there with not much except a few palm trees and lots of coral. And we spent from August, when the war ended, until January of the following year out in the Western Pacific. We ferried troops back and forth between various places, between the Philippines and Guam and Tinian and places like that. We also picked up Chinese troops in Haiphong, which was then French Indochina, which is now Vietnam, and we transported those Chinese troops to the northern border of China, Tsingtao, where the Great Wall of China comes down to the sea. At the time that we're doing this, Harry Truman is saying that we are not, the United States is not transporting Chinese troops to Manchuria. Well, that was a little bit of a spin back in those days. We didn't transport them to Manchuria. We dropped them in Tsingtao. They walked across the border and they were in Manchuria. We were into Korea. We got lost, sort of. We were headed for Shanghai, which was a long-time desire of mine to see Shanghai. I had an uncle, my mother's brother, who was in the Navy back in the late 20s and early 30s, and he was on the Yangtze River, on the riverboats that we had on the Yangtze River. And of course he talked about Shanghai, and he brought home gifts from Shanghai and so on and so forth. So as from childhood, you know, I had dreams of Shanghai. Well, we were ordered to Shanghai, and we got out to sea one day, and they changed our orders and sent us instead into Inchon, Korea. And I think they forgot that they had done that. We swung on the hook in Inchon Harbor for 45 days. It got to the point where, you know, none of us were even going ashore anymore. They wouldn't let us go to Seoul. We had to stay within the confines of Inchon. Well, there's not very much in Inchon. It was a port city. And in fact, we were empty. We had no troops aboard. We had very little in the line of gear or anything like that. We actually organized a basketball league in the after hold. The officers played, you know, the deck gang and so on and so forth. We had a regular basketball league. Sat there without any mail. That's why I'm convinced we were forgotten out there, because they just let us swing on the hook and you know, no mail, no word of any kind. I don't know whether the captain was wiring, you know, Washington and saying, hey, what about us out here? A little bit like General Half-Track and Camp Swampy in the comics. You know, we were out there forgotten. And when they finally did find us again, they sent us to Japan. In Japan, we picked up, we were part of Magic Carpet, is what they called the return of the servicemen at that time. The Magic Carpet, taking them from overseas back to the United States. Those that were eligible for discharge and so on. So we left Sasebo in Japan, and we took the Great Circle route to San Francisco. We got into San Francisco and dropped off the troops that we had aboard down in the southern part of San Francisco Bay, down at Hunters Point. And we're headed for Mirror Island, which is up in the northern half of San Francisco Bay. And about the time we dropped the hook up there, the fog settled in. And we were fogged in for 2 days. Nobody could go ashore. We could hear the horns honking over on the on shore and so on and so forth, and we were out of provisions. It was the only time in my military service during World War II that we had to eat K rations aboard ship. And there we are with you know, we could have probably thrown a stone from the ship, but that San Francisco fog, if you've never been in it, you talk about pea soup, it's really soupy. You can't see your hand in front of your face hardly. So after the war, we made it into a couple of other ports that, or at least one other port that was really interesting, and that was Tsingtao, which is in northern China. Had been a Marine Corps base in Tsingtao, and also had a large settlement of White Russians. So it was somewhat of a cosmopolitan city. Lots of shopkeepers and so on and so forth who spoke English, and so we were the conquering heroes, so to speak, into Tsingtao. We were the first convoy in there after the war. And our first trips into Tsingtao and so on and so forth, you could ride all afternoon in a rickshaw and give the rickshaw hauler a dime, and he was, you know, just practically kissing your feet for the dime. About the second or third day, the rickshaw drivers and so on and so forth would be down at the dock, and the minute you stepped off, it's $1, Joe, $1. You know, the price went sky high because the sailors had, in particular, the sailors had, you know, accumulated a lot of money in crap games and elsewhere, and were willing to spend and just, you know, like water off a duck's back. So, but I had enough points, which was the determining factor on your being released from active duty. I had enough points not to go back after we landed in San Francisco and so on and so forth. And our original orders were to go back to Japan and pick up more troops and bring them home. So I had enough points that I got off. I was released from the ship. And no sooner did I get off than they changed the orders and they sent them to Bremerton, Washington, where they were decommissioned. Our ship was decommissioned. But anyhow, I was anxious to get back to this part of the country. My wife was living with my aunt in Corning, New York, and so it didn't make that much difference, but I came back. I was discharged out of 90 Pine Street in New York City. And so that's the story of World War II.
You were a newlywed through this whole experience. How did you stay in touch with your wife?
We sent many, many letters to one another. Of course, I was an officer, and the censorship of an officer's mail was a hit and miss affair. We knew enough to not spill the beans as to, you know, put stuff in there that would be harmful. But before I left for overseas, the wife and I had worked out a code as to, and we used people's names, you know, have you seen anything of Jane? And, you know, I mean, that meant, I can't tell you the code anymore, but that meant Pearl Harbor or, you know, Guam or Tinian or Japan or China or something like that. So she knew where I was most of the time. Obviously the mail, by the time our mail got to her, or her mail got to us, you know, we were long gone from where the letter said we were. But at least she was able to follow my traipsing through the Pacific. Mm-hmm. And so, and then I went back to Syracuse and got my degree from Syracuse. I could have gone back to Dartmouth, but Syracuse was closer by, and I had a love for Syracuse, and so I went back to Syracuse and got my degree. And and of course I stayed in the Naval Reserve, stayed in the reserves, and Of course, when the Korean War came along, Uncle Sam decided he needed me again. So he called me back in during the Korean War. I didn't go overseas. I was sent to Arkansas, and everybody says, good Lord, what's the Navy doing in Arkansas? Well, it was a naval ammunition depot outside of Camden, Arkansas, called Shoemaker Naval Ammunition Depot. And it was a rocket assembly plant that was operated by a contractor, making the Mighty Mouse rocket and so on, which was a air-to-ground or air-to-air missile, 2.25 rocket. And so I had the feeling that if I was going to get called back in service, every time I turned around, maybe I ought to stay. So when I reported in and so on and so forth, I signed up indefinite. And so about 18 months went by, and the Secretary of Defense, or the Secretary of War, I don't know which one it was at that point in time, decided that the Korean War was winding down, and that they appreciated my coming in, but they didn't need me anymore. So I was released from active duty, and but I stayed in the reserves and spent well, I got with active duty and with the reserves, I got 20 years in. So I'm a RET apostrophe D after my rank and so on and so forth. So.
Do you remember the general attitude of this nation toward Korean War at that time?
I think the Korean War attitude towards of the United States and so on at that time was the same as it was World War II. Vietnam obviously was a different story, but I don't recall much in the line of protest and so on and so forth about the Korean War. It was an opportunity, or whatever you want to call it. The domino effect was the catchwords at that time, that if we didn't stop it in Korea, that it was, Korea was going to go communistic, and then it was just going to domino right down the line, and all of these various countries and so on and so forth out there were going to go communism. And and I don't know, maybe we as servicemen were naive at that time, but we believed the necessity of doing what we were doing. Both World War II and Korea. We would have no more thought of protesting and saying, the president doesn't know what he's doing, what are we doing out here? And maybe there were some ne'er-do-wells in the service at that time, but not anything, well, we're not seeing it in the service today, but we're seeing it, in groups and protesters and so on and so forth, and we saw it during Vietnam. But I don't think there was anything like that in Korea. And, and even the protests of the Vietnam veterans, I think they rankle a little bit anybody that was in World War II or the Korean War. We didn't get any parade when I came home. I didn't meet the mayor of the city and get the key to the city. I came home and went on with my life. And one of the great complaints seems to be of the Vietnam veterans is that they didn't greet them with open arms when they came home and so on. So, I don't know, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool patriot, I guess, and even today, with today's war going on, I believe Bush was doing the right thing. I believe him. I'm not sure that I would have believed his predecessor, but I do believe Bush.
Okay, during the Korean War, where was your wife then?
Well, she was with me.
She came
See
with
that?
you?
Yeah, oh yeah.
But did you live on a base?
Yes.
Okay. What was that like?
That was the life of Riley, really. We lived in the housing area at the depot. Of course, there was an officers club, and there was a golf course. That's where I first started playing golf. The wife and I, we had a 9-hole golf course, and you know, it was about 2 minutes from our house in the housing area. You could go over and play 2 holes or 9 holes or whatever you wanted to do, and you know, it didn't cost anything. You weren't getting in anybody's way. You could go over to the 9th green and just practice, you know, without getting into trouble of any kind. And the officers club there, the military presence was small because it was run by a contractor, and the base, the major share of the base and so on and so forth. But the executives of the contractor were allowed in the officers club. So we had many good parties, you know, with the civilians and with us military personnel and so on and so forth. So, and the townspeople were great to, you know, us Yankees. You know, we're in the deep South down in Arkansas, but we had great times with the townspeople. We were outside of Camden, Arkansas, which is sort of down the southwest corner. And but we had a great time. We, you know, and you know, my job was not all that tough because if we'd had 2,000 or 3,000 military, I would have had a lot more to do. But with only maybe 50 or 60 military on that base, I was dispersing officer and supply officer, and so I didn't even have a storekeeper working for me. You know, I didn't have an enlisted man. I did all the work. I calculated the pay and ordered the supplies that were necessary for the military operation and so on. So all by myself.
Could you try to describe a typical day down there then?
In Arkansas? Well, I worked 8 to 4. 8 to 4, okay. And, you know, played golf after work. And it was warm year-round. You know, we had snow once while we were down there. But there wasn't any, you know, there wasn't any back-breaking work. I did have to stand the duty once in a while. Not all that often, and the duty was overnight duty. You would take the officer of the day vehicle and you know, toot around the base, you know, just keeping an eye on things and so on.
And there was never any trouble?
No, we never had any problems. It was the life of Riley down there, really. Okay. My contribution to the Korean War was the man I relieved down there was sent to sea and so on and so forth. The supply car officer that I relieved was ordered to sea duty. So, I mean, he went out in the Pacific. You know, I don't know really where he went or, you know, how deeply involved he was, but at least I released a regular Navy man to go to sea. So.
Do you think it was the Navy man's choice to do that, or do you think he just was following orders? He was
just following orders.
Okay.
You know, I mean, they decided that probably they wanted as many. This guy I relieved, so on and so forth, was a Naval Academy graduate. And so I would guess that rather than send reservists to sea during the Korean War, they preferred to have, you know, regular Navy guys out there. So Not that I couldn't have done the job that he did, but, you know, they didn't choose to send me out there, so. But we liked Arkansas.
Okay.
We almost died of the heat the first summer, but then we got used to it.
How long were you there?
Well, about 21 months with the Navy, but then I stayed on. I went to work for the contractor after I was released from active duty. So we were there a little over 4 years. As I say, the heat the first summer almost killed us. I lost about 20 pounds. You know, I was dripping ounces wherever I went. But the next summer I was right out there with the natives playing golf, you know, thinking nothing of it. So I guess you get acclimated to the heat. You know. And we weren't very far from Hope, Arkansas, which was the watermelon capital of the world, and, Bill Clinton's hometown. And Bill wasn't there at the time, but anyhow, you know, at the height of the watermelon season, you could fill your trunk for $1, the trunk of your car with watermelons. And, you know, whoever was going over for a trip was calling the neighborhood and saying, "You want a couple? You want a couple?" And so on. So, no, it was good living down there. We enjoyed ourselves.
For the rest of your career in the Navy, what did you do? Were you ever called through the reserves? Were you ever called?
Well, not called up in the reserves, but you know, I spent 2 weeks every year on active duty training, as well as attending drills. There was a time when I was in Kentucky that there was not a Naval Reserve Center close enough, and I kept up my reserve work with correspondence courses. But I was a member, well, when I got called back in during Korea, I was a member of the Elwyn R Surface Division 3-62, which was located in the Water Department building up at the end of College Avenue on Water Street at that time. Then when I came back to the Elmira area and so on and so forth, I was in that same outfit, only then it was up on Lake Road, up, you know, where the Naval Reserve and Army Center is up on Lake Road. And so, but I had, you know, I attended drills, you know, my active duty for training. I went to Norfolk twice. I went to Portsmouth, Virginia once. I went to San Francisco. I went to New York City, Brooklyn, and places like that twice. I went to a refresher course at the Naval Supply Corps School in Athens, Georgia. You know, those were my 2-week training duties that I took part in.
And what were you doing in your civilian life at the same
time? I went to, after I left the contractor in Arkansas, I went to work for Corning Incorporated, or Corning Glassworks at that time, and came back here and actually had a house built in Corning, and we lived in Corning, and then Corning Glassworks put me on their trail, and I went to Kentucky. I went to Harrodsburg, Kentucky, and then I came back to the Corning area, and the second time back is when we moved to Big Flats, and we've been 41 years now in Big Flats. We didn't figure that. We figured we were on that into Corning, out of Corning, into Corning, which so many Corning Glassworks employees experience. But I changed jobs and was promoted here and promoted there and so on, but all within the Corning area. So we've, our brand new house that we had in Big Flats is now 41 years old. It has some squeaks and squawks that it didn't have when it was new. So.
I have just a bunch of questions. If we can go back to
Sure.
The beginning of World War I. Do you remember the day that Pearl Harbor was attacked?
Sure.
Okay.
Well, we were listening to the Arctic League broadcast, and when they broke in on that broadcast, and it wasn't TV, it was radio. So I can remember my mother shedding tears, and I really didn't understand why. I was a senior in high school. My brother was a sophomore in college, and she could see, you know, both my brother and I going in the service. And, you know, so we went to war. I wasn't suddenly injected with a fervor of patriotism that said, you know, I'm going to quit school like a lot of guys did. A lot of guys quit right in the middle of their senior year and joined up. I didn't, you know. So, but my mother could see ahead as to, you know, what was in store for her boys. My brother joined the Marine Corps. And of course I was in the Navy, so.
Was Pearl Harbor the reason you decided to go into the Navy then?
I think the influence of my uncle, who was in the Navy back in the 20s and 30s, was probably, my brother tried to get in the Navy also. My brother had a mastoid operation that destroyed the hearing in one of his ears. And he tried Buffalo, Syracuse, Albany, New York to try to get in the Navy V1 or V12 program, the same as I got into, and the Navy turned him down. The Marine Corps finally took him, and there were Marines in the V12 program also. And my brother was sent to the University of Rochester. And my brother had 3.5 years of college. So, you know, he only needed 1 semester to get his degree, and he got it at the U of R. And so, you know, Pearl Harbor was a watershed point, but I don't think I realized it at the time. I was, you know, I was young. You know, at Pearl Harbor I was only 16. You know, I was 17 when I went in to the service and so on and so forth, but you look back on it now and I should have been more patriotic or more, I don't know, something, like a lot of the others. And just like I probably should have been scared aboard ship, but I don't ever remember being scared. So.
Okay. Can you describe the ship in a little more detail?
Okay, it was an attack transport. We had a crew of somewhere up close to 300. It was not a big vessel. It would be dwarfed by a battleship or even a cruiser as far as that's concerned. Well, we carried 12 LCVPs. And LCVPs were small landing craft. Everybody thinks of landing craft in World War II as being LSTs. Well, LSTs were a pretty good sized vessel. But the LCVPs we carried aboard our ship. They swung from davits, you know, down either side of the ship, so on and so forth. And they had a ramp just like an LST. But they were small and probably could carry a maximum of maybe 24, and were built to go in and land on the beach. In other words, to go in and hit the beach and drop their ramp and let the soldiers or sailors or whoever it might have been, Marines, you know, hit the beach. We were late, obviously, getting out into the Pacific, and we never got into a landing as such. Being an officer, you know, I had a room, a stateroom, if you want to call it that, with 3 other officers. It was far from being palatial or anything like that, but we all, you know, stood duty, so we were all coming and going in that room. We ate in the wardroom, and you know, that was served on china And with silverware and so on and so forth, it wasn't the tray type deal that the sailors were in their mess hall and so on and so forth. So we had a good life aboard ship even. I think the thing that we missed most, or that bothered us most, was heat rash. You know, it was hot, and we could not open portholes and so on and so forth after dark because the lights would show through and so on and so forth. And water was at a premium aboard ship. And so showers were doled out, if you will. It was no case of being able to take a shower every day. So most of us suffer from heat rash, which can be itchy as all get out. And we hit the port in Tinian on one of our sojourns out in the Pacific, and before we dropped hook and so on and so forth, the announcement came over that we were going to have swim call in the harbor in Tinian. And of course everybody was just ecstatic over that, you know. Well, nobody from this part of the world had ever stopped to think that the waters of tropical clime and so on and so forth are warm. And they're warm salt water. So, I mean, taking a swim in warm salt water is not extremely refreshing. And so, yeah, we went swimming and so on and so forth, but it was not the happy experience that we had thought it would be to be able to go swimming. So nobody thought about the water temperature must have been 90 degrees. It was like a warm salt bath.
What was the longest stretch of time you were at sea without going into port?
Oh, I guess coming home from Sasebo to San Francisco.
How long was that?
That was like 23 days, 24 days.
What did you guys do on board that ship?
Well, before we left Sasebo, they allowed us to go, they allowed a work party to go to an armory in Sasebo and pick up rifles, Japanese rifles. And they picked up enough for everyone aboard ship. They were rough. The metal portions on the bolt and so on and so forth were knurled, and the stocks were not finished as you think of a rifle today in the store and so on and so forth. But one of the things that many of the enlisted men decided to do on our way back was to finish those rifles. In other words, to sand down the wooden stock and so on and so forth, and get paint out of the paint locker, lacquer and so on and so forth. The only problem was, after we were about a week or 10 days at sea, we all of a sudden had a real bad epidemic of poison oak. The stocks of all those rifles were made out of poison oak. And they were no problem, and they wouldn't have been any problem if we had left them all alone, and hadn't sanded them and so on and so forth. But we had a real bad breakout of poison oak aboard ship. The laundryman who worked for me, in other words, the laundry was one of my duties and so on and so forth, almost died from poison oak. He was sort of a heavy-set young man and so on and so forth. And when I visited him in sick bay, he was almost unrecognizable. I mean, and he hadn't done a rifle. He got it from the clothing of everybody else. So that was one thing that kept us busy coming back.
How were you guys treated for the poisoned oak? Was there a medic on board?
Oh yeah, we had a doctor, and we had corpsmen too. We had a doctor and a dentist and cadre of corpsman.
What kind of medicines or what kind of relief could you get from this poison oak?
Calamine lotion, same as poison ivy, you know, that's about the extent of it. Except they must have given my laundryman something else because he was deathly sick with poison oak, so on and so forth. His face all swelled up. And, yeah.
So did they abandon working on the
Well, yeah,
rifles?
yes.
Okay.
I never had worked on mine. You know, I'm not much of a craftsman, and, you know, I'm sort of a klutz when it comes to handyman things. So I figured I'd take the rifle home the way it was, which I did. And so.
And these rifles were for the men to take home with them then? They were their personal rifles after that?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Well, I mean, they were issued with a license, if you will. I mean, it was something that was made up aboard ship, but every one of us had one of those so we could get them through customs and everything else, and without anybody raising a fuss because we were carrying a rifle with us. I don't know if we'd have flown aboard a plane, I don't know what they would have done. But of course, planes were not that prevalent as far as transportation was concerned back in 1945, 46. Never got seasick aboard ship, but I got train sick going back and forth from the East Coast to the West Coast.
Okay. Well, on the return trip, how long did the poison oak last, first of all? When were you guys over that?
They were, you know, it lasted 6-8 days, you know, something like that. But, you know, they suffered while it lasted.
And what did they do to pass the time after that?
Just the general run of things, cards. I suppose there were crap games down in the, you know, officers, after the day's work was done, didn't really investigate what the crew was doing. You just soon would have not run into a crap game because you would have had to break it up. But I'm sure they were going on down in the lower regions of the ship. And there were probably poker games too. So I imagine the troops entertained themselves pretty well. Of course, we had a small library aboard ship of books and so on and so forth. And of course, we had a soda bar. And we had gotten mail, a whole bunch of mail just before we left Sasebo. And so I suppose the guys wrote many letters to be mailed when we got back to the States. So but the time passes by, you're standing, you know, you're standing watch, you know, 4 hours on and 12 hours off and so on and so forth. And so, you know, and it changes your sleep pattern a little bit if you've been on the midnight, if you've been on the mid-watch, which was midnight to 4 a.m., your roommates were very careful not to disturb you when they rolled out for breakfast at 7. So, and you know, you got to the point where you slept in, you know, in odd hours. It didn't change my sleep patterns. I can lay down and go to sleep most any time.
As an officer, what did you do for recreation if you weren't allowed to do crafts or play poker or things like that? What did you do?
We did play poker in
Okay.
the wardroom
Okay.
at night. And backgammon was big with regular Navy guys. I don't understand, I don't know of the connection between regular Navy guys and backgammon. But it was mostly regulars that played backgammon aboard ship, and us neophytes and so on and so forth, and reserves, we were playing cards. And there was never any, I don't think I ever saw a bridge game aboard ship. There was some euchre. And as I say, we did play poker off in the corner of the wardroom and so on and so forth. So we managed to keep busy and keep out of trouble and so on. So, and I didn't have a huge, I had one storekeeper working for me as dispersing. I was dispersing officer. There was my boss was a supply officer, and he handled the supply end of things, and I handled the dispersing. And so I had one storekeeper working for me. So, the day, the work day, we were both pretty busy, calculating pay and, that type of thing. So regular office routine. But we didn't go stir crazy.
Okay. Were there ever any storms while you were out at sea?
When we were in Okinawa, and this was just prior to the kamikaze attacks, there was a typhoon. And they ordered all the vessels out of the harbor of Okinawa, and then we sailed in 10-mile squares to avoid one another. And the South China Sea is shallow, and so that storm really kicked up the sea. We didn't suffer any damage of any kind to the ship, but the ship, you probably never have been aboard a vessel where the screws come out of the water. We would go down into a trough like this and come up out and back down into another one and kick this, and the stern of the vessel would come completely out of the water, so that the screws were out in the air. And when that happens, it shakes a ship, like crazy. We had no hot food for those 2+ days that we were riding out the typhoon, because you couldn't keep, they couldn't keep dishes on the table, even though we had, when you're in a bad storm, they have sideboards they put on the table. They're about that high. But the dishes would, go back and forth and back and forth. And in the galley, they couldn't even make coffee because the vessel would be going like this and slopping the coffee out. So we had nothing hot in those 2+ days that we were riding out the typhoon. Okinawa got brushed with that typhoon, and they weren't naming typhoons at that time, so I don't know, it wasn't Andrew or Maria or whoever. It was just a typhoon. This was, the fall of 1945.
Do you remember if your ship or if any of the other ships sustained any damage during that typhoon?
Some of the carriers that were in there, the carrier deck sticks out over the bow, like this. Mm-hmm. And we saw 2 or 3 carriers whose flight deck was draped down over the bow of the ship from them going into the waves and so on and so forth, and the tons of water that was falling on them. And they obviously had to go in for repair afterwards to repair the flight deck. But the square portion of the flight deck was right straight down over the bow of the ship. So it took its toll out there, no doubt about that.
You mentioned VE Day. Do you remember any special celebrations or anything?
We were in San Diego, VE Day, and all the bars were closed. I remember that as a significant point. Even though I was still a young kid, I was still interested in bars. And yes, there was a big parade in San Diego and people, on the streets. It was not like the pictures you saw in Life magazine of Times Square or anything like that, but there was plenty of celebration going on in San Diego on VE Day.
What about when you must have crossed the International Dateline?
Yeah.
What was the ritual on board the ship?
There's not much on crossing the Dateline. It's crossing the equator, and we never went south of the equator. The equator is the domain of Neptune and so on and so forth. But we never went well, as I say, we hit 37 different ports of call out there in the Pacific, but we never got below the equator, so we never got a chance to celebrate that.
But not much happened with the Dateline
No,
on your ship. Okay.
other than changing the clocks.
Okay. All right. Can you think of anything else that you'd like to say? I'm kind of running out of questions.
Oh, I don't know. The war brought me a wife.
Mm-hmm.
And as I say, this last January we were married 58 years. So I guess that was one of the good things to come out of the war. Obviously, my staying in the reserves, in addition to my active duty time, I draw a pension from Uncle Sam now, and along with my other, with Social Security and savings and so on and so forth, the military pension pay is sort of like a little bit of icing on the cake. So I have, I earned that with, all the drills that I went to and the training duties, the 2 weeks, and not all employers paid me for those 2 weeks. I mean, sometimes it was my vacation without my wife, and so those are two things that came out of my military service. An awful lot of friendships came out of my military service. We have spent many, many vacations down in South Carolina and so on and so forth, visiting old Navy friends that we made up in Maine, and we've got friends all over the United States.
Did you stay in touch with people on your ship or people from school?
Both, yeah.
Okay.
My ship was not in existence for an awful long time, which means that group was not together like some of the battleships and so on and so forth, where they were together for 3 or 4 years during the war out there. So there never has been a reunion of the USS Elkart people. And we were loaded with reservists like me, who were anxious to get back to civilian life, and
You went out of commission in 45.
yeah. See, we were commissioned in February of 45, and then they were decommissioned in March of 46. So the ship was only in existence for a year. When they decommissioned it, they turned it over to the Coastal and Geodetic Survey Department, so on, for use in mapping and things of that nature. So I kept track of, and it finally trickled down to Christmas cards, with particularly my roommates, who I was closest to aboard ship, and with several of the others, and so on, my boss and things like that. It finally, the correspondence trickled down to Christmas cards, and then that sort of even fell by the wayside. And but some of the closest ones, yes, I stayed in contact with. In fact, one of my roommates just died this last year. I didn't know about it. I sent him a Christmas card, he and his wife, for 2002, and got a note back from his wife and said that Joe had passed away back in, I don't know, June, I think it was, a year ago. And so those friendships stayed, and they're slowly disappearing. I mean, we're not kids anymore. Yeah, I had a birthday Sunday.
Oh, happy belated birthday.
People say, aren't you concerned? And I said, no. I said, having another birthday is a lot better than the alternative. So.
Have you been involved in veterans organizations over the years?
Yeah, I was, in fact, I was one of the few active duty Navy officers who was commander of an American Legion post down in Arkansas. After I was, even before I was released, I became commander of an American Legion post that was on the base down there. And our biggest contribution, and in fact, a few years back we went through that base and so on and so forth, is with volunteer labor. We built an Olympic-sized swimming pool. We had the use of bulldozers and so on and so forth that belonged to the base, but still it was all volunteer labor. And I was commander of the post there on the base when it was finished. And the pool is still there. The old housing area at that base in Arkansas is now known as East Camden, Arkansas. It's a village of its own, has its own police force and the whole works. It's about 5 miles outside of Camden, but it's known as East Camden, Arkansas now. And of course, all the houses, the military housing was all sold off to individuals and so on and so forth. And so they have altered the houses. The houses were all in a military housing area. The houses are all the same, you know. I mean, you talk about row housing. I mean, that's what it was. Our old house, where we lived and so on and so forth down there, the people have added a bay window on the front, and and it's painted brown, where everything was white. You know, all of the military housing was completely white. So, you know, the base down there, you know, I was involved in the Legion down there. I ended up not only as commander of the Legion post, but I was vice commander of the district down there too, and a member of the 40 and 8. I let that fall by the wayside for a good number of years, but I belong to the Legion in Big Flats now. So I'm not extremely active, but I do support them.
Now, you mentioned that swimming pool is still down there? Is it used still?
Oh, yeah. Okay. It's a municipal swimming pool now of East Camden, Arkansas.
Great, I wonder if they know their history.
But we put a marble plaque in the sidewalk that says Brooks McMahon Post 301, American Legion, so and so forth, dedicated, must have been 40 or 56, 55 must have been dedicated. But it was an Olympic-sized pool. We had a big grand opening and so on. We had the Louisiana State University swimming team as an attraction, the opening of the swimming pool. And in fact, one of the members of their team was Miss Louisiana of, I don't know, 1952, 4 or something like that. But so, yeah, that swimming pool is still there and still in use. It's the municipal swimming pool.
That's neat. Jumping back again to World War II, when you were in port, can you talk a little bit about the interaction with the natives that the men on your ship may have had?
Other than in Tsingtao, where I mentioned about the rickshaw drivers and so on and so forth, we didn't mingle that much, I don't think. Manila was a little bit different. The Philippines, there was an awful lot of English spoken and so on and so forth, made it easier to talk with them. But of course, at the time we were in Manila, Manila was really destroyed during World War II, and so there wasn't that much to see and do in Manila, or that much opportunity to associate with the Philippine people. And our time into Japan and so on and so forth, we were the second convoy into Yokohama after the war, and I've never seen such destruction as there was in Yokohama. And there were no people. We were not allowed to go into the center of the city. We were confined to the dock area, basically. in Yokohama, and of course, we destroyed Yokohama. Everything except the docks, which we knew one day we'd like to use, and so on and so forth. But about one block back from the docks, it was just rubble. And Yokohama is a big city, or was a big city, is again. But so the you really didn't, a lot of these ports of calls were atolls, and like Ulithi, so on and so forth. There really weren't any natives left there. We moved the natives out of the way, and so on and so forth in many instances, after we took control of these various atolls. And so the only thing to do in a place like Ulithi, they issued you 2 cans of beer and a softball and a bat. And so that's what the officers played, the enlisted men, and so on and so forth. And of course there was very, very little ice, so warm beer leaves something to be desired. Still does.
I think that's all the questions I have right now. If you think of anything else, just give me a call and we can continue this.
Okay. I told you in the beginning, my war experiences were minor compared to, like Art Kiefer or some of these guys that flew 99 bombing missions and so on and so forth, or the Army and Marines who fought in Europe and so on. I have to consider myself lucky in World War II that I didn't see any more action than I did. And as I say, I was a young snot-nosed kid in World War II, even though I was married before I went overseas. But,
everybody had a unique perspective, and yours is certainly just as important as the others. So thank you so much for taking time to do this.
Okay, no problem.
Appreciate it.
I've enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Okay, Heather.